CataractCoach.com podcast series, episode number 29 with Dr. Jack Holladay. Now, I'm sure you've heard the name Jack Holladay before. He's really been a pioneer in the ophthalmology space, especially when it comes to optics. We talk about his background in engineering and his work in optical engineering and how he translates that into a way of thinking to approach some of the complex problems we have in ophthalmology, such as better accuracy in IOL calculations, and where is that going, and what are the various factors. He talks about the Holladay 3, his newest method of doing calculations, which is coming out in the near future. We also talk about the negative dysphotopsias. What's the optics behind it? Why does it happen? Really a fascinating discussion with a brilliant man who gives so much insight into everyday optics that we use in our clinics and operating rooms every week. I guarantee you're going to learn something great from this podcast. Check it out. So welcome back to our Cataract Coach podcast. Today we have Dr. Jack Holladay. I have learned so much from Dr. Holladay over the years. I love his way of the engineering mindset and the way he thinks of things, the way he explains optics, and even all his backyard experiments, which we will get into. Those are the ones where he took the photos to explain depth of focus, depth of field. Jack, welcome, and thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Uday. I'm so happy to be here.
Tell me about your path in ophthalmology, because people always look at your name, they say, okay, Jack Holladay, MD, MSEE. You're obviously an engineer.
Well, that MSEE is a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering, and I actually spent 2 years in graduate school finishing my master's in electrical engineering, and then took some classes at Southwestern Medical School in Dallas. I was at SMU, and ended up enjoying physiology and anatomy, and decided rather than finishing up my PhD, which was going to take another 5 years anyway, I'd go ahead and go to medical school. And
Sure.
So I got accepted to medical school in Houston and went to UT Medical School.
Oh, fantastic. And then what led you to ophthalmology? So electrical engineering is one thing, optical engineering is another.
Well, it's interesting. I co-opted in my undergraduate years and worked a semester at Vero Electronics there in Dallas. And they had contracts with the military to make night vision scopes, the things that you can go out and actually see in the dark with. And so I worked with the engineers that were mechanical and electrical on night vision devices throughout college, and so ended up being an optical engineer also, because at that time there weren't optical engineers. They were only mechanical or electrical, and you learned optics from that. So I got a good background in optics during that time. And then when I did my first rotation in medical school on ophthalmology, by within about 2 to 3 weeks, I was better than the chief resident in terms of understanding how the instruments worked, how to use the slit lamp and all that stuff. So the chairman of the department there at UT Houston offered me a position in the residency program when I was in medical school.
Oh, that is fantastic. So, yeah, you've always had obviously that engineering mindset, and I think that's different because most ophthalmologists, most physicians, in fact, we don't start off with engineering in our backgrounds.
That's true. Well, you know, Steve Charles, who's a good friend, was also an engineer, and he always gets upset when people say, well, you were an engineer before you became a doctor, and he gets really upset. He says, I'm still an engineer. I'm still an engineer.
Right.
And what I thought about there is that engineering gives you a specific way to look at things, why, what fors, physics, and that kind of stuff. And that's just as important to a physician that's, say, an internist, because problem solving and looking at things and trying to figure out the reason why things work oftentimes gives you a better understanding and better ability to treat things, because you know the reasons why things happen and figure out why. So the engineering thought process, I thought about that, and I'm not sure whether you have an engineering mind and you end up in engineering school, or you end up going being taught the engineering skills and stuff. And I think it's the latter. You think like an engineer, and then you end up fine-tuning your skills when you go to engineering school.
Yeah, it's funny you brought that up about how you look at things. In fact, one of my favorite presentations of yours is the enigmatic penumbra. If you can
Yeah.
explain some of that to us. That, to me, your explanation was brilliant. I remember taking a video of your entire talk because I thought it was so amazing.
Well, that was something I worked on for probably 5, 7, 8 years. The first article we wrote actually wasn't exactly right, and it wasn't until it dawned on me that enigmatic penumbra, the shadow that we see with intraocular lenses on the side, what the real cause of that was. And it's so simple. It turned out to be just a light that comes into the eye from way off at the temporal side. If there's a space between the intraocular lens and the iris, well, that space allows light to come through that's unrefracted by the lens. And that also allows light to come in that's refracted by the lens. And if that overlaps, then it's lighted. But if it doesn't overlap and there's a space, a void between the refracted light through the IOL and the light that misses the IOL, well, then there's no light there. And that void is what patients see as a dark shadow or penumbra. And it took me a while to figure that out, and then another couple of years to actually write it up, because drawing out the optics, getting the diagrams and all that stuff was very difficult. And Mike Simpson, who's a PhD in optics, was very helpful with that and helped me with the ZMAX ray trace and all that stuff. But that last article with Mike was the one that really solved and answered the question. And I get mad at old Maskett because he makes it sound like it's still a question as to what it is. And it is no question in terms of who's going to have it exactly, because there's so many factors. There's
Right.
angle kappa, the distance from the IOL behind it, and several factors, the cornea, steepness, and da-da-da-da. Well, but all of those factors are like risk factors for heart disease. You can't tell somebody you're going to have a heart attack tomorrow, but you can
Right.
look at those factors and tell them what the risk is of having a heart attack. And you can do the same thing with looking at all of the factors, and we list that in that article, all of the factors that contribute to that. So it's not a mystery any longer. It's a result of several factors, and it does depend on the patient, and we can't predict exactly which one, but we know all the factors that cause that.
So if we're in our clinic and we're seeing a patient preoperatively for cataract surgery, what are some of the hints that this patient may be more prone to negative dysphotopsia?
Well, that's a good question. The only real factor that is something that you routinely measure is probably the power of the lens. The higher the power, the greater the chance that after it's refracted, it won't have light that goes as far forward as somebody that has an average or lower powered lens. So hyperopic patients would be at more risk than myopic patients, and the higher the power of the lens that you compute, the higher the risk that they would have the negative dysphotopsia. And then the other factor that relates to that is the second eye. If they have it in the first eye, then the association of having it in the second eye is much higher. But those are the only other two factors. Now, there's things like angle kappa and several other factors, but they're the kind of thing that the average ophthalmologist doesn't measure and look at and do. But if somebody is a high hyperope and or ends up needing a high-powered intraocular lens, then their risk of having that penumbra or shadow is greater.
And then if the patient has a negative dysphotopsia, how can we surgically go back and lessen that?
Well, that's a good question too. And it's a difficult thing, because what happens is about 16% of the patients end up with that shadow the day after surgery. And then about a year later, that drops down to about 3%. So it's 3% are the ones. Now, by the time you've waited, if you wait for a year for it to drop down to that 3%, well, then you got patients complaining during that time. And the other thing is you don't know which ones are going to go away. And it becomes harder to do a lens exchange or something like that if you've waited a year. So all of those factors are difficult. So the first thing you do is you give the patient some time to neural adapt and see if he's in the majority of those that go away.
Sure.
And then if that doesn't happen, then the options that are available are a reverse optic capture, where you take the lens and reverse optic capture, where you actually move the IOL in front of the bag and take the anterior capsule and get it behind. So that reverse optic capture is one. And then the other ones are silicone lenses are less prone to that because their index of refraction is lower. So they certainly are one of the things. And then actually outside the country, in Europe, they make a thing that's like a retention ring that has a lip on it that if you put that in front of the lens, it goes away completely. Unfortunately, you can't get that in the United States yet, and I'm not sure they've even submitted it to the FDA. But those are the options that are really available today to correct the negative dysphotopsia.
So if I have a patient I'm going to take back to the OR, let's say a year later, they're just not happy, and they have a single piece acrylic lens in the bag, I'm probably best off expanding that lens, recalculating for sulcus placement, and then do the reverse optic capture with 3-piece silicone lens. Haptics in the bag, optic in front of the rectus.
That's exactly right. I think that's the best option. Now, the other option that works is to put a secondary piggyback lens in. But you got to get one that's plain old power because, you end up pushing the other one back. So you could put a little, but you end up having to find a silicone lens that's down to about 0 to 5 diopters in order to be able to do that and push it back. So the one other option is a secondary piggyback, which doesn't require you to remove that original lens.
Right, because what if the original lens is like high power toric or some other, let's say, trifocal design that you want to maintain?
Well, and that's why a 1, 2, 3 diopter silicone lens in the sulcus. But again, if the patient's hemitropic, well, then you can't get a plain O silicone lens. And so we have to do the option you just said of exchanging the lens, recalculating for the sulcus and all that stuff. So the secondary piggyback is not usually a very good option because of the power change and the fact that you're on. But if you had somebody say that was myopic, came out with a surprise too, that was -2, well, then you could do a secondary piggyback with a +2 or +3 silicone lens and do it. Right. But that's much less common than having them right on the button and having to go back, so the lens exchange is better.
Right, for sure. Now, for lens calculations, you were one of the first people ever to go from just 2 input variables of K and axial length to having the Holladay 2 with multiple input variables. And how did you realize that you needed many more input variables?
Well, that's a very, very good question, because initially with the Holladay 1, the original guy that calculated the ELP was Binkhorst. And it was back then that he used axial length and he'd use a 4 millimeter ELP. And then if the axial length was 10% longer, he'd make it 10% bigger, 4.4, and scale it basically proportional to the axial length. And so we were looking at that and said, well, it seems the vault of the cornea and the K with steeper Ks and stuff is like a bridge. And so the distance to the water would be related to that. So in 1988, we published a Holladay 1 that had the basically axial length in K, and that was the first formula to ever do that. And then there were scores of formulas that came out after that that basically used AL and K. And then we began to see things from Olson and from Barrett that had included, actually the Holladay 2 came before those. And what happened is we knew that to predict the ELP, the more you knew about the anatomy, the better you could do. So we began to look at anterior chamber depth and lens thickness and corneal diameter, and that's where the Holladay 2 came from. And we actually found that refraction was another variable that was a parameter. So we ended up at 7. But what happened is the refraction we wanted was the one before they began to have cataract changes as an adult. So it was supposed to be the adult refraction before a cataract formed. Well, the problem is a lot of times you didn't have that. But second of all, a lot of people would use the refraction at the time of surgery, and if the guy had a 5 diopter myopic change, the refraction actually would draw them off so that the Holladay 2 wasn't as accurate as a 1 because they were using the wrong measurement. So, but anyway, it held up well until about, actually I'm giving a talk on that at the Hawaiian Eye. It held up really well until about 2 years ago, about a year ago. And what we found was that there are measurement errors that are made with Ks and axial length, anterior chamber depth, white to white, all of those things, and that those measurement errors can end up having a preponderance in a certain direction that artificial intelligence can figure out. So, for example, let's say like Koch found. Koch found that when Wolfgang Huygens calibrated the IOL master to ultrasound, he didn't have any eyes over 26 millimeters. So what he ended up doing is extrapolating that linearly out to 36 millimeters, and it turns out that wasn't true. Ultrasound measures it accurately, and what happens with optical biometry, it ends up overestimating the length for a lot of technical reasons, but basically a 36 millimeter eye is a 34 millimeter eye on ultrasound. So Doug figured that out, and what I'm saying is artificial intelligence can also figure that out. So it can take mistakes that are made from measurement error and compensate for those. And so what I'm seeing is right now 85%, 84% is about the level that you get with large studies with thousands of lenses and hundreds of surgeons. And if you get 84%, you're good. But they can get up to about another 2 or 3% with artificial intelligence by saying, okay, I can compensate that axial length as it gets longer and shorter. And you can't get that from an anatomical formula because the formula, there's no way for it to recognize that you're making a consistent mistake in the axial length like Doug found and like artificial intelligence. So what we're seeing is now, Warren only used axial length and K and anterior chamber depth, and discounted lens thickness, discounted white to white, and that's a mistake. The reason that he did that is they found that it wasn't significant, and yes, for 4,000 or 5,000 eyes, that's true. But as you get up to large numbers of 10, 15, 20,000 eyes that we can get now from large aggregate databases, white to white will show up. For example, white to white measurement was a critical measurement in the Holladay 2 because we did a study with Jim Gills. And what we found is there were 2 types of short eyes. There were axial hyperopes that had a normal anterior chamber with an 18 millimeter long eye. And then there were the pygmy eyes that were actually proportionally smaller and had small anterior segments with the short eye. And so the white to white tells you which one they are. Right. If they have a 12.5 millimeter cornea, well, if you do a large study with artificial intelligence, there's 89 to 90% of the eyes are in that mid-range. And there's not enough short eyes to show up that difference between the pygmy eye and the axial hyperope. So they never found that correlation because you have to go down and look at the little eyes to do that all by themselves. And artificial intelligence won't do that. So they didn't have enough. So what we're working on is that with a combination of the Holladay 3, and the Holladay 3 is going to use artificial intelligence to help us recognize some of those anatomical, but still use the anatomical relationship of determining the ELP from the anterior chamber, the lens, the corneal diameter, and the axial length, but then refining that value to take into account consistent measurement errors that will do that. And the result of that will be about 88% of the eyes can be within plus or minus a half a diopter. Now, with adjustable lenses, Calhoun can get, our RX Vision now, or RX Sight, can get up to about 94% of the eyes within a half a diopter. So they will always be able to beat by almost 6%. And the reason for that is the variability in our measurement of axial length, K reading, anterior chamber, white to white, lens thickness, and prediction of ELP hit a dead end. You can't do better than that, whereas with an adjustable lens, you don't care. Let it end up wherever it wants, give me the measurement errors, and I'm going to take that refraction on day 14 after I've had surgery. And then that refraction is accurate, almost a quarter of a diopter in both toricity and in sphere equivalent. So they can adjust that and get that next 6-8% that you can't get with a regular formula. So ultimately, if I were going to have cataracts surgery today, I'd have it with an RX Vision. I'd target this eye for about minus 1/8, and I'd target this eye for minus 1. And with no cylinder, everything perfect, you've got J1 plus vision and 20/20, 20/15 vision at distance. And there's so many patients that are happy, and you can't get that with just a regular IOL calculation, because you're going to end up with about a quarter of a diopter CIL and a quarter or half diopter of sphere equivalent. So you can't get that fine tune. And that fine tune is the difference between 2025 and 2015.
Now, what about the future? Do you think we'll get to refractive index shaping and adjusting lenses? Because if you fix your eyes right now and you get to perfect plano or your zero CIL, but then what happens in 10 years? You start to develop more against the rule CIL and the cornea.
Yeah. Well, but it's pretty slow. The Japanese studies and the other studies, you drift about a quarter of a diopter against the rule every 10 years, every decade. So, 20 years, you may drift as much as a half a diopter. And it is true that refractive index shaping may have a future because of that. So I agree that an adjustable lens, whether it's shaping with a refractive index shaping lens or doing it with a light adjustable, and I've worked with those companies that use that indexed shaping basically, but it's like doing an RK on the cornea. In other words, to get a flattening, you end up having to take those refractive index and you put the same kind of pattern on there that we used to do in the very early days of excimer laser stuff. And so I'm optimistic that over time we'll figure out how to do that with lenses, but I don't think that's in the near future, even though they say it is. I don't believe it, but it certainly has a future if they can overcome the problem of being able to do that repeatedly.
Now, what about the toughest eye? You mentioned earlier, probably the toughest is that 18 millimeter axial length, so a very short eye, but yet a relatively normal or even large anterior chamber. That's a super difficult calculation that can vary by diopters.
Well, and that's exactly right. The variability in the power of the IOL when you're up around 50, 60 diopters versus the normal 22, 23 diopters is 3 times more difficult to get as accurate because of it's directly proportional to the lens power. So if you can get 85% of the eyes within plus or minus half a diopter that are using a 22 diopter lens, you can only get a third as many of those eyes within plus or minus a half a diopter at 60 diopters. So you won't even be close, or you'll be 3 times worse. So it's directly proportional to the power of the lens. And so what I tell people is, in many of those cases, you have to use a piggyback anyway. And so what we do is we tell them to use the maximum power in the back lens, and then put whatever is calculated for the secondary piggyback in the sulcus as the front lens. And then if it comes out hyper, and don't use the lowest power for the front lens, use one that's 2 or 3 diopters higher than that, so that basically if you're off, you can come back and adjust only that front lens up or down 2 or 3 diopters and just exchange the front one in the sulcus to get it right on the button. And that calculation is almost exact because it uses the Holladay refractive formula. And all you're doing is you're converting from whatever the refraction is at the spectacle plane to the equivalent IOL in the sulcus. So it's not an IOL calculation using axial length. It uses the refraction and the vertex distance, and you know exactly where the lens is anyway. So that calculation is exact. So if it comes up minus 250, well, then you know that a minus 2.5 diopter lens is taken away from whatever your secondary piggyback that's in there in the first place will give you just the exact power. And I've helped scores of doctors with that calculation, and they only need to do that exchange of that front lens once.
What about doing the surgery in 2 steps? Do the initial cataract surgery, put in your max power lens in the bag, let the eye heal up, come back a month later, and now figure out what the power of the sulcus lens should be?
Well, it depends on what you end up with the piggyback. In my experience, it ends up that about half the time you're close enough with that first surgery that you don't need a second surgery. So that what happens, you've reduced the need for 2 surgeries by 50%. So, but if you're up around 60 diopters, and that's the other thing, if you're up around 60, you're going to have to use a 34 and then another 26 or 28 diopter lens. So that patient won't be able to see at all because they'll be, 20 diopters hyperopic after surgery. Right. So, the point is reducing the need for second surgery by 50% and providing them with a value that's close. The other thing that's a factor there is that secondary calculation the second time and adding to or subtracting from the existing lens is much smaller power, so it's much more accurate because you're just adding a little bit to the existing lens rather than calculating. So you never need a third surgery that way. The other way, you may end up not being able to get it because if it comes up that says you need a 28 diopter lens, well, you've got to come up with a refraction in that spectacle plane at a vertex distance that you measure to a half a millimeter, and on and on and on. So I'm not a proponent of that. I think you should put a lens in, and then if you have to do a second surgery, it's much more accurate and won't ever require a third.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So you do a single piece acrylic in the bag, and then a 3-piece silicone lens for the sulcus?
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right.
And then the incidence of things like interlenticular opacification is pretty low then, that way.
Well, it's almost zero because what happened is it was when 2 lenses were put in the bag that you got that actually you got an interlenticular membrane, and you also got a compression that caused a flat spot in the center of the 2 lenses. So you never want to put 2 lenses in the bag. And if you put one in the bag and one in the sulcus, then the one in the bag has the same properties as the original single lens in the bag, it stops the pacification from that edge being up against the front of the capsule so you don't get it. But you never put two lenses in the bag because of the internal and the fact that you'll get a hyperopic shift about the third to the fifth year from the compression of the two lenses.
Got it.
Johnny Gayton was the one that was had found the most of those because he put both of them in the bag and did lots of them, and found at about the fifth year they began to get a hyperopic shift.
That makes a lot of sense. Where do you think we're going then? So ultimately, you said, if we have AI involved in lens calcs, we can kind of approach high 80s, maybe 90%, plus or minus half after.
No, you'll never get to 90%. Well, no. Let me back up. 84% is the highest you'll ever get with AI with the current technology. Now, if you and the reason that it's only 84 and not 88% is because of the corneal measurement. What happens is this. We spend a lot of effort with OCT measuring the back surface, and the back surface is not important from the spheral equivalent calculation. Less than 5% of the patients will have a quarter of a diopter difference in their K reading from measuring the back surface. Now, astigmatism, that's not true. Doug showed us, and Doug showed us that basically the majority of patients have about a quarter to three-eighths of a diopter of against the rule astigmatism on the back surface of their cornea. And so that significantly impacts the calculation because for toric lenses, it means that if you have with the rule and there's a half a diopter of against the rule on the back, then you need to reduce that with the rule value. And if they have against the rule, you're going to need to increase that or leave it the same.
Sure.
And so the Baylor nomogram said reduce the with the rule by a half or three-quarters of a diopter and leave the against the rule the same because you're going to get a little against the rule fade anyway, and it turns out so that's okay. So it's important for astigmatism, but it has nothing to do with the spheral equivalent calculation. What does have an impact, though, is the original keratometers took a 3.2 millimeter ring sample.
Sure.
Okay. And that's because if you take a 3.2 millimeter diameter and the pupil is on the average 4.5 millimeters in the refracting lane, that's exactly 50% of the area outside and inside that 3.2 millimeter ring. So Javal and all the Germans that came up with those didn't pick that 3.2 arbitrarily. They picked it so the area would be the same, and that's what you want, the area. Now, when you pick a 2.5 millimeter, which is what IOL Master did, now all of a sudden 75% of the area is outside and 25% is inside. Okay?
Got it.
Now, when you go down to the lens star that's got a 2 millimeter diameter, now that's 4 and 16. It's less than 25% of its inside and 75% is out far. So they didn't consider what the Germans had done 100 years ago and made those smaller. And there's a second thing. That ring, we only take a sample of a ring on the cornea, okay?
Right.
And I show a picture that Mandel did about 30 years ago, and it shows that no two people have the same shaped cornea. So when you get a ring measurement at, say, 2.5 millimeters, the actual, what we call zonal power over that 4.5 millimeter zone can be up to a half or three-quarters of a diopter different from one patient to the next with the identical K reading. And that's because that ring is not a good sample of the full 4.5 millimeter zone that you need. So what will happen is two things. In the next 5 years, we'll begin to end up with these optical biometers doing topography and measuring thousands of points rather than measuring 4 or 8 or 16 or 24. And when you measure 24 points, even 24, is not sufficient in a 2 millimeter ring to describe the power of that whole cornea.
Yeah.
So the cornea is the reason for that 4% or 5% difference between what we're doing today and what we would do if we would do topography and measure that zone. Now, we actually did that with the Penacam. The Penacam has been measuring back surface for 15 years. And so I worked with them almost 10 or 12 years ago, and we developed a measurement called the EKR65, which basically measures the front surface, measures the back surface, and it does it over a 4.5 millimeter zone. It doesn't do a ring. It takes 14,000 points and calculates the power of that 4.5 millimeter zone. And that is, and we did an article on RK and showed that it was 4 times as accurate as anything else that's available.
Wow.
But unfortunately, Kevin Miller and Ken Hoffer did an article, and they didn't use the right A constant. They used an anterior chamber A constant and came out with a diopter and a half error. And basically, it's resurrected back when people figured that out. But they said, gee, it's making a diopter and a half error because they went back and measured the position of the lens, and the physical position of the lens and an A constant are different. The A constant is almost a diopter and a half higher for a lot of reasons we don't care about. But if you go back and do that, you find that that EKR was a very accurate measurement, not only for refractive surgery patients, but for normal patients too. And it did one more thing. And this relates to keratoconus. People don't realize that the keratoconic cornea has a cap, and then it has paracentral power. So it's almost a bifocal refractive lens.
Oh, sure.
Now, it is, in fact, almost equal to the LensTech lens. If you look at that, and I show a picture of the Y&I of the topography of a person with keratoconus and the design of the LensTech refractive bifocal. And what you see is that topography map and the design of the lens are almost identical with that hotspot down on the inside corner. And so what happens is, if you check patients with keratoconus, you will find that in 90%, it's not 100, but 90%, that they can hold reading material about 10 to 15 centimeters in front of their eye and read J1+.
Wow. So the top half has obviously lower power, and then where the cone is, which is a little bit more inferior, it has a higher power. So
that's right. But your brain doesn't do that. It's like a bifocal lens. It doesn't matter that it's on the bottom. A bifocal intraocular lens, you don't think about the bottom half of the top half. You think about those 2 focal points, and what happens is the clearest one is the one you look at. It's like looking at a double image through a plate glass window. It's the one you focus on, not the fact that they're a result of the different position in the lens of the 2 powers. So that's the point. The bifocal cornea of a keratoconic patient is the same as a refractive bifocal, so it doesn't matter if it's down. You don't have to look down. What happens is that when you're here, that 5-6 diopter stronger power gives you a better image through the bifocal than it does through the paracentral power, through the cap. So what I've told people for years is that when you have keratoconus, that's the first thing you check. You see if they have a near point that's right here that they can read J1+. Then you know that they're using the paracentral power of the cornea for distance, and they're using the cap for near. Now, when you measure with the keratometer, all right, you end up getting the cap power. And there's optical reason for that, but it ends up that smaller image comes from the cap, and that's what the keratometer measures. So you get the cap power. So you'll always measure 58, 54, something like that. But it's the cap power, and that's the wrong one. You're not going to run a calculation with the bifocal power of an intraocular lens for distance. And you don't use the cap power of a keratoconic patient For distance, you use the paracentral power. So what you do is you take your topographer, go around the outside, and you can measure the cap and look at what the cap power measures on the keratometer, but use the paracentral power by sweeping around with your mouse and going around the cap and finding that power. And then that's the power that you use for your intraocular lens calculation for distance, not the cap power. Now, the EKR65 on the Pentacam, we realized that it'd be bifocal. And what you see is you see two peaks on the power distribution across the cornea, just like a bifocal intraocular lens. And we wanted the lower power, so the EKR65 looks at the peaks and begins to come up with 65%, not 100% of the average, but takes 65% of the powers that are closest together with the highest peak, and it tells you what that lower power paracentral is, so you don't have to do that. Because we found it's also true in normal patients, that they end up with bifocal or trifocal corneas, and so you don't look at the average of the power in a multifocal lens. It'd be like calculating it with the average power. You lose the near, the middle, and the distance for a trifocal, and then the two for the bifocal, and you shoot it. Now, the reason I say 90% of the time, and say 50 keratoconus patients that I help up with calculation, there was one patient that ended up where the cap, he was hyperope. He had like a 18, 19, and that's rare.
So unusual. Yeah.
Most keratoconic patients are myopic and have a long eye, but there is always an exception. And so what I'm saying is, if the thing that would have happened is if he'd tried to hold that at near, he'd say, well, no, I can't read anything, because he was using his cap for distance. But that was 1 in 50. So it's very rare, but you still should always check the near vision in a keratoconic patient, make sure it's near, and then you know he's using the paracentral power.
Right.
And that's what every one of those algorithms is ultimately telling you, that you take the K rating and subtract 5 to 7 diopters and say you don't have to do any of that. Just measure that paracentral power, and that's the right value for that patient.
Wow. So yeah, I like that pearl, but check them ahead of time in the clinic, give them the near card, and see, do they hold it 10, 15 centimeters away, and can they make it? That makes so much sense. So I guess where we're going with the machines is, we should, instead of just having machines that measure our biometers, just measuring keratometry at 2 or 2.5 or whatever millimeters, they should have an integrated topographer.
Well, and that's what'll happen. What will happen is in the next 5 years, that's exactly what will happen. All the emphasis has been in measuring the OCT on the back cornea, and I'm saying that doesn't help us one bit with spheroequivalent calculation, does with astigmatism. But if we were to measure that zonal power by just putting at least 400 points, and better 1,000, and having a cone out there just like a topographer, and you're right, integrating that, the new optical biometers will end up having a topographer on the front that it uses rather than a ring keratometer. And then the one other thing, though, that's important is the pupil size. And that is, if you have, because what happens is the average pupil size in the lane is 4.5 millimeters in the dark. But you'll have people with 5.5 and people with 3.5. So if you measure that pupil size in mesopic conditions and then calculate that zonal power for that patient, then the power of that cornea will be exact. So going forward, we'll need zonal power over the patient's entrance pupil, which is the apparent pupil that we measure. And with those two, we will bump from 84 up to about 88%. And anybody that gets 90 or above, all right, is doing it for one surgeon, okay, for one lens, okay, and has excluded the ones that are out of bounds, okay?
Right.
And I'm saying that's not fair, because I mean, the article we did with Ron Mellis, one of the people that had been using AI came up and they were pretty far down. They were like fourth formula or fifth formula. And we said, well, we did the same thing for everybody. We used all the eyes, we put them in. They said, well, you can't do that. You have to exclude those eyes that the algorithm says are out of bounds. And we said, well, and so what happens is you'll hear them say, I get 98% of our eyes within that after we've excluded the 10% that are out of bounds. Okay. Well, that's 88% is what that is, because the other formulas don't exclude it. But AI will ultimately, so you got to take all comers. You can't exclude out of bounds. And so I'm saying anytime you see an article, you'll look down there and you'll see that anybody that gets over 90% has done one of those things. They've done it for one surgeon, one lens, and they've excluded them out of bounds, because you can't get over 85% today with the measurements, and 88% will be the upper limit with pupil size and topography going forward. Mm-hmm. And the only way to get that next 6 or 7 or 8% is going to be with an adjustable lens.
Got it. But yeah, you're right. I've seen the studies too, where it's like, it's just one surgeon, one lens, which I think that's okay, because I'm concerned with my data. So me, the one surgeon, and this is my fastball lens. But then you're right. If you exclude the out of bounds, well, now you're excluding those ones that would have been up.
And see, the problem with one surgeon and one lens is, and a single study. Okay. So I tell people you got to have thousands of lenses, scores and probably hundreds of surgeons, and multiple lenses. And well, or one lens is okay. And then that would be applicable to the individual. But you'll never see a study that's over 85% with those, with hundreds of surgeons, thousands of lenses. And it is possible to get a few more percent with one surgeon. And the reason for that has to do with our surgical abilities. And that is, if you put viscoelastic in the IOL the same way every time you do the surgery, and another guy does it a little different, mm-hmm. Well, the lens won't be at exactly the same position. So you can, by using one surgeon, maybe get a 1 or 2% higher value because of consistent differences that you don't get with them. But it's not applicable to the average surgeon out there, because you're not going to be doing the same things that he is. And those little adjustments that are made in AI are not adjustments like in the A constant, where you moved it up or down a little bit. Those are adjustments in taking axial length between 21 and 22 millimeters and reducing them by 1/10, and increasing the K between 47 and 48 by 1/4, that kind of thing. It's not an adjustment that's made in the A constant, so there's nothing the surgeon can ever do to match that.
Right, because just adjusting the A constant doesn't make sense, because you're changing all eyes up or all eyes down.
Well, right. And that's what I'm saying. Those little 1 to 2% differences for an individual surgeon are not A constant adjustments for all the lenses. They're little bitty tweaks that the AI does for little things, like I gave the examples there. And those are not applicable to the surgeon unless he's the same guy.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So I guess that's where we're heading with this down the road.
Well,
it sounds amazing.
So that's right. In the next 5 years, you'll see topography added to those. And then the mesopic pupil size is the other factor.
Yeah.
Because if you have a small pupil, that same exact cornea has a different power than it does with a large pupil.
Yeah, that's a great point there. Now, speaking of pupils and pupil size, and obviously aperture size relates very, very strongly with our depth of field. Tell us about your studies with that. I loved your experiments in the backyard with the photography.
Well, we did those with AccuFocus, and now they've basically developed an intraocular lens. And what we did is, obviously, depth of field gets greater and greater the smaller the aperture. All right.
Right.
So we know that the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. But the image quality from diffraction actually gets worse the smaller the aperture. So that's why in the clinic, we don't use a 0.5 millimeter pinhole. We use a 1.2 millimeter pupil or pinhole. And the reason is if you used a smaller one, diffraction would not let you get to 20/20. And if you use a larger one, then refractive error of cylinder and sphere would reduce the image. So that optimum pinhole size for most people in small refractive errors was 1.2 millimeter pinhole. Now, what I looked at was this was 15 years ago when I first started working with AcuFocus. We went back and I looked at all the data I had, and I'd published an article with George Waring on RK, and they had better vision for a given refractive error than normal patients because they had a multifocal cornea. But what came out of that was that we ended up setting a standard for what, for a given refractive error in terms of sphere and cylinder and pupil size, what the normal average visual acuity would be, and did that for all refractive errors of cylinder and sphere and all pupil size, and published that thing. So we went back and looked at that data and found that with a 1.6 millimeter aperture, okay, the vision was limited to 20/12. Okay. Because we didn't ever want to use an aperture that was smaller so that it became the limiting factor in a person's vision due to diffraction. Okay. So we ended up recommending that they make that entrance pupil 1.6 millimeters, and that's at the corneal plane, because that's what all the studies that we looked at was. And the size at the IOL plane is about 1.35 millimeters, but that's okay. 1.35 at the corneal plane is an entrance pupil of 1.6. And that's because the light comes through the cornea at 1.6 and then cones down to 1.35 at the intraocular lens plane. So that aperture of 1.6 entrance and 1.35 at the IOL is something that they went with the intraocular lenses too. And what we've seen is a couple of things. Now that gives you a depth of field that's almost a diopter and a half. So it's equivalent to one of the EDOF lenses. In other words, it gives you middle, and you can see in good light, you can see down to reading distance. But in medium light, it's really just about the same as an EDOF in terms of its performance, about a diopter and a half. And so that's what they went with. Now they're looking at maybe tweaking that, giving a little bit smaller for patients, because the biggest application for that has been in people that have irregular corneas, post-refractive, keratoconus, PKP, corneal scar, all of those, right, exactly. And in those patients, you'll see 2200 down to 2025, 2030, 2020 vision with that pinhole. And so for those people, and there's millions of them out there, that is a lens of choice because it gives them. Now, the question becomes, and they're doing it in Australia and have probably 1,000 patients down there that have bilateral implants. Obviously, it's the same thing we ran into in patients back when I was a resident in the 70s when you put them on pilocarpine. When the pupil came down to 1.5 millimeters, they couldn't see in a dark room. They couldn't go to the movie and find a seat. And so when you're in dark conditions with both eyes with those implants, it's like being on pilocarpine 1% when you walk into a dark room. Now, in one eye, that's not a problem. But you know how the Australians are. They're real robust, crazy people. So they've tried it and it worked for them. Whether that would work in America, that would be a little doubtful because we're not as tolerant of If you get up and go to the bathroom at night and you have that in both eyes, you're not going to see that ottoman sitting in front of you and trip over and break a hip. So
right.
you're not going to see. So that's the only limit there. But in one eye, and we may actually make, anyway, so that for patients that are, and actually for those patients that have or had refractive surgery that are 2,200, well, putting those in both eyes for those patients is a much appreciated, because the balance of not being able to see in the dark versus being able to see in the light is a big trade-off. And they say, I trade that any day. I just have to be kind of careful about walking around and stuff, but in the dark. But that's what the biggest indication is. And it's worked well in normal patients as an EDOF lens also.
Yeah, no.
But that background, I got to tell you though,
tell me,
Sharon was very mad at me when we did that experiment, because I have a picture. She was my assistant. We put up 20 of those things in the backyard, and I had to measure them, and I had it set up, and I had my the cameraman that was my technician come out on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. The sun had to be just right, because if the sun had gone too far, we got shadows on my little panels, and if it was over here, it didn't work. And so, man, it was so 10 o'clock Saturday morning, we get out there, and what do you think happened? The wind started blowing. So all my little flaps would be down like this, and they'd flip up. So, we tried to wait. It was blowing so hard that one of those 20 things would flip up, so we could never take a picture with them in there. And so we couldn't do it that day. And I was so depressed. So I went to bed that night, and I said, Lord, please make it calm tomorrow. Let it be a sunny sky with no wind and everything, so I can get those pictures. And sure enough, we got up 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. It was calm as could be. The light was just right. And that's what we took those pictures.
That's fantastic. I love hearing about that. Now, going back to the small aperture lens, the Apthera IC8, you're losing a lot of light though, right? I mean, it's like if I compare a 3 millimeter pupil, let's say someone has a 3 millimeter pupil with a traditional monofocal lens versus a 3 millimeter pupil, which is now 1.36 at the IOL plane.
Well, no, just use 1.6, because at the entrance pupil of the cornea is the only place that size counts. So it's 1.6 at the cornea. So it's still 1.6.
Okay, but you're losing more than half the light then, comparatively speaking.
Well, it's 1/4 the light, because it goes up by the square.
Right.
So if you got a 3 versus that, but you have to remember that light, like all of the senses in our bodies, we respond logarithmically to things. Touch, temperature, and light. And if I change light by a factor of 2 in a room, you won't even know it's changed. If I change it by a factor of 4, and if you look at that performance of visual acuity versus light levels, you'll find that it's what's called a sigmoid chord, and it's logarithmic. So it takes almost a log unit difference, a factor of 10 in light levels, in order for you to notice the difference. So that difference between 3, but that's the point. The difference between say 4.5 and 1.5 is 3. So the light level is 9 times less, and that's getting close to a log unit. But the depth of field is 3 times. The depth of field goes up by the ratio of the diameters, and the brightness goes up by the ratio of the areas. So from 4.5 to 1.5, you have 9 times less light, which is a log unit, but you have 3 times the depth of field and 3 times the improvement in vision. So, and maybe even more than 3 times, because that point spread function is related to the area too. So you probably have a 9 times better point spread, and that's why the pinholes bring people down that are 2200 down to 2025.
Right.
A
Right.
full log unit. So brightness is not a consideration. The only place that, and your retina adjusts to that anyway, and your pupil adjusts to it. In other words, when you walk out, the only time it matters is when you get to threshold light levels. You're in a restaurant, there's only one candle on your table and one candle on every table, so that you're at 1 foot candle with one candle. Well, at that light level, you would notice you won't be able to read with that because you don't have enough light. But that's the only situation. Anywhere else above that light level doesn't matter.
And what would you choose for a refractive target then to make best use of the pinhole? A little bit of mild myopia?
Yeah, about a half, 3/4 of a diopter.
Fantastic.
That's the target, because what happens is it broadens out. So if you put it at -50 to -75, that depth of field still keeps you at 20/20 at -75, and it extends that depth of field another 0.75 at the other end.
Right. Gives you a wider range for sure. Makes sense.
Right.
So what can we expect next from Jack Holladay? You've always been such an innovator in our field. So I guess you were saying Holladay 3 at some point.
Well, I'm going to be working on that this year, and there's a bunch of things that I've got to work on to get that. So that's going to be but probably a year away before I get to that and get the final result. It becomes something that we'll implement into our IOL consultant and then share with the optical biometer families. And we've just finished something that's been so rewarding and so much fun with a guy named Rand Wilcox, who's a PhD statistician at USC, and then Doug Hoke and Lee Wang, which I know you're familiar with, that the four of us over the last 3 years have developed the statistics that you need to use when distributions are not normal, not Gaussian. And for prediction errors, like with intraocular lens formulas, they're never Gaussian, because the purpose of an intraocular lens formula is to try to get as many of those points at zero in the middle, so it's squeezed together. And that's called a leptokurtotic curve, but the bottom line is it's not Gaussian. So when you compare formulas using a Fisher F test or a student T test, which are based upon Gaussian statistics, they're wrong. They come up with p-values that give you the wrong thing. So for the last 3 years, the four of us have worked on developing a series of basically 20 functions that we published these in Journal of Cataract and Refractive Surgery and told people how it works and gave the article. But we've also put it up on a website that allows you to download what's called the R statistical package, which is a free software that people can use. And Rand wrote all of the code that you could download this module that he has, and it has these 20 formulas on there. So you can actually go in and say, if I want to do a comparison of the means or the standard deviations between two intraocular lens formulas, you hit that in, hit that package, put in your data, and boom, it prints it out and gives you the exact right values. And working with these guys, especially Rand, has been so rewarding, because in the past 50 years, I'd always get to a statistician and the first thing they do is go to SPSS, which is a standard cookie cutter package that does statistics and stuff. And it doesn't work for non-Gaussian distributions. And Rand is a free thinker. And so he writes all his own code, thinks, and he says, no, you're right, Jack. And the first thing he does is goes off into some theoretical thing that I love to talk with him about, because it's not cookie punch. It's thinking like an engineer would, except it's a PhD in statistics. So all of these packages, and then Lee Wayne came along about 6 months ago and published one last correspondence in JCRS that actually puts it in Excel so that you can run this wrap-up function, she called it, and it basically prints out all the statistics that you need for an article, and it puts it in Excel and tables so that you don't have to do anything but cut and paste the table.
Wow,
And
that's so easy.
Yeah, no, and it's worth looking up. They relate to statistics of spheral equivalence, and then we did the same thing for astigmatism, which is where you have to look at it two-dimensionally with all those double-angle plots and stuff, but we did that too. So it's all there for people to look at, and that's been great. And then the other big area for me, which is not direct ophthalmology, but it relates to my family, and I've got 6 grandkids, and 4 of them are, 2 of the older ones, one's married, and the other ones just went off to college. But the 4 younger ones are all boys. They're 9 and 11, and they all play Little League baseball. And we go to 4 or 5 baseball games every week. And these guys are going to be professionals. They're going to get scholarships to college because they are so good. I played a little baseball, but these guys are night and day. And it's so much fun to watch them because they're so good and so talented. But that's my life. I go to 4 or 5 baseball games, and on the weekend, they play in tournaments. So they'll have 2 or 3 games on Saturday and then have 6 games on Sunday because they end up in the championship. And so we end up having to play in the finals of those things. But I'm so blessed. Because the other thing is now it's been 2010 is when I had that aneurysm repair. And of course, like I told you, 1 person in 400,000 survives an ascending aneurysm. So that's the odds of me being here today. And I'm actually the record holder in terms of longevity after the repair for 13 years after that. So every day that I get up, I say a little prayer and I thank God for letting me be here and for letting me spend time with my family, because I wouldn't have gotten to see any one of those grandchildren if I'd have been in that group of the other 399,000.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, I'm so happy to hear you're continuing these great projects on ophthalmology, and of course that you're having an amazing time with your grandsons in baseball. That is so awesome. Well, thank you, Jack.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Uday. It's nice to be able to communicate, even though it's over the internet with podcasts, to all of the friends, because the one thing that I've always enjoyed the most is being able to see that little light go off in a resident or a practitioner when they kind of get it in terms of a concept. And my goal in all of these things is to try to make the concept, put it in their words so they can understand it, not in my words. And so I really am grateful for this opportunity to once again share a few things with my colleagues.
Thank you, Jack. I sincerely appreciate it. And I want to remind our viewers and our listeners, there's a new podcast every single week. And we'll put some links down below for some great information from Dr. Holladay and what he's working on now.
Thank you for enjoying that podcast with me. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. We release a new one every single week. And please leave a comment and let me know who you'd like to have on as a future guest. We'll see you next time.